that you wanted to know what actually it does and the range of capabilities, and a little bit also about the configuration, right? There is that lab. If you really want to dig into it, I will show you. You can do it. I will show you a demo very similar to that. So I just want a little bit of variety. So I will show you with the Intune. But it's basically that, right? You need to have some sort of like a VM or a mobile phone to test it out. I created a VM in Azure. If you have a trial or if you have an Azure subscription, you can do it. Very basic VM. So I will talk about that momentarily. But let's actually talk about what it does and why it exists, right? So as you can see here in this diagram, right, we have the Defender for Endpoint right in the middle. And as with other defenders, it basically job is to make sure that it provides protection at the enterprise level for all the workloads. So basically, while Office 365 Defender focus on the productivity, email, SharePoint, Teams collaboration, right? Defender for Endpoint focuses mainly on providing defense for the endpoints, predominantly devices, right? So it basically get installed on the device, right? So that's sort of like the starting point, and then it basically monitor, right? It basically start doing the detection, and then it take those signals and send it to the defender, which basically going to be the starting point for you to analyze and detect, right? Now there are a couple of steps here, right? The first thing is the onboarding. I will show you a demo for that. There are various ways to do it, and we're going to talk about that next. But the point is, like, you perform the onboarding. Typically, in a large organization, it will be some group policy, pushing that. Predominantly tools like Intune, which is basically a device management solution. Microsoft Intune is their version, but the third party also supported on like Mac and other platforms. The point is that you onboard the device. Right now, you have some sensory input coming out of it. And then how do you sign in? So this is basically the other part. Those inputs are going in. And basically, based on the state of your device, this is important, right? This is the whole idea of improving the security posture. Once, Microsoft actually know more about the device, so Defender for Endpoint is part of it. But then remember, like the whole idea with what I showed you, there's a risk factor and there's a conditional access policy. Then it can feed into that, right? So you make a decision based on device state, compliance state, and then basically the user risk. And I will show you how it works in a minute. So endpoint security is probably one of the key features in the Defender that you will see quite a bit of questions. And the questions most likely going to be around like how to improve the posture. And you have a situation where there are like user identity based scenario, and then there is a device based scenario, and the combination of the two. So for example, I have a iPhone, and I also have my Surface Pro, and I wanted to improve the posture, right? So I do wanted to deploy endpoint protection for both. It's available for both. So you do want to perform a little bit of a configuration. There is a question, actually a relevant question, where we can, about the labs. Yeah, so labs, actually, the links to the labs, like the artifacts and instructions how to set it up, are actually in this presentation. Optional, recommended but optional. I mean, I don't want you to do every single lab. It's almost lab worth of like 7 to 8 hours. But if you do have time, then do them. Like a lot of demos I'm showing are basically either like equivalent of labs or inspired by the labs, right? Labs are usually longer. So I can highlight which one related to the endpoint at the end of this section. So that will help you if you want to do it. I hope that helps. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about like what are the key capabilities, right? Because you see this in the exam. So one of the key capabilities you wanted to know is something called the vulnerability management, right? So the question here is that how many people actually know what vulnerability is? Because that term, you will hear a lot in security. Can someone just put it in the Q&A? I just wanted to get a sense. It doesn't matter it's right or wrong. It's just like what you think vulnerability is. It's important to just gauge on that a little bit. You can put it in. I cannot see your name, so don't be shy. It's all anonymous. Yeah, I should have a poll for that. So the next iteration of this course, I will put a poll for that. Okay, so you will see this term and hear this term a lot. Also, you will see it a lot in the Defender portal. So basically, I will explain what it is. Basically, when you look at any system, there are weaknesses in the system, and when you exploit that weakness, then basically that weakness is a threat to the system, right? Now, there are ways to sort of like, categorize them. And the reason why it's important to categorize them is mainly because of there's so many tools, like, we're talking about right now Defender for Endpoint, but Microsoft has so many other Defender products, and then just add on top of that third-party products that your company may be using, right? So there are different ways and different frameworks out there. You will see that that when you look at the vulnerability stack, and then there are frameworks like MITRE attack framework that will have sort of like list them in a very methodical fashion. There are other frameworks too, but there's a common one used today. So you'll see that used in the literature a lot. And that's what essentially is sort of like picking it up here. Microsoft Defender Vulnerability Management lists down a few of these capabilities that build in. So it basically allows you to do the asset discovery and inventory management. So this is the first part to actually perform any vulnerability assessment, is to have a updated list of inventory. So the first thing that endpoint will ask you to do is actually have the agent or some sort of like a combination of agent and tool installed together to basically get the sensory input out, so data out, so it can actually feed into the system, right? So you can do something with it. And that's where the vulnerability and configuration assessment comes in. So you can actually do it yourself. Like, a lot of time your job as a security operations analyst is actually to take the logs and analyze like if something is going on or not, right? That's actually where the query language will kick in. So you have to get a little bit comfortable with that aspect where you're performing that. Now, if there's something like obviously wrong, like for example, if there is like some sort of like a ransomware based attack or vulnerability that get exploited, and then the Defender for Endpoint and then other combination of products can find it out. Because remember, like, in order for the malware to install, either it can be installed through the email that comes in your inbox and you open it, or maybe there's a link that you click somehow. So a lot of things can happen, right? So that's why, there'll be some sort of like assessment that goes on. And then basically what you do, right, there's a protection, there's a prioritization, right? Like, what vulnerability should be higher and lower. And then the actual remediation. You'll see that remediation part, which is so critical, because that's how you're actually saying that, well, we're going to remediate and get back to a risk. Either we absorb the risk or we going to remediate it and devise so the user is back to the safe state. So the idea here is that it will give you that tool, right, to do that. It has functionality built into that. All right. So, well, shout out to the people who actually responded to the question, what is the vulnerability? I'm just looking at the responses now. Yeah, so pretty much everyone got it right, at least the idea. So there's no system in the world that doesn't have a weakness. The question really is that how you assess it, and then when you understand it exists, what you do with it, right? Because if you have a weakness in the system, it's a risk, it's a security risk, right? So there's a common security like risk frameworks out there. I'm not going to go in detail, but just a general practice, you think about it like either you absorb it, you say, well, I just have it. The cost of this risk, like fixing it or remediating, is too high than the asset itself that I'm defending. And you say, well, I've just absorbed it. So I know there's a risk, but chances are so low and the cost is so high, I'm going to absorb it. Or you're going to deploy something, right? Like you deploy the endpoint for protection and management, right? And there's a cost to that, but the cost is substantially reasonable compared to the cost of the actual exploit itself. If you have a data breach, then cost is probably just improbable to even calculate, right, what damage it will do to your business. So there's a lot going on there. It's an entire field actually, risk management in the enterprise, and there are other certificates that more functional side certificate or managerial side certificate, they actually call it out a lot. Maybe a good topic we can discuss later in the final section. talking about the roles and responsibilities, the job market. So coming back on the track. So Microsoft Defender for endpoint deployment. Okay, so this is something that you will see in the exam from a configuration standpoint, like how do you like roll it out? And again, the idea is not to enumerate on every single option. I think the important thing to understand at a high level, like what option exists. You don't have to like configure every single option. There is actually a document that is available, and link is actually in the slide deck. It's right at the bottom here. I don't know if you guys can see it, but it is. It's a PDF. That basically talk about a different sort of like a topology of deployments, right? And you will find that with any like a large scale product or service which require a combination of things, then there are different patterns of deployment, right? But let me go and talk briefly about these three things, because you're probably going to see this in the exam and having an understanding how and where they fit in. So the first thing is the architecture alignment, which is basically like you need to understand as a security operations analyst that the environment you're working with, what type of environment, right? So it can be a cloud native, which just means that it's cloud only. There's no hybrid. You're just living in Azure and Office 365. Fantastic. You get a lot of basically features in the cloud, like a SaaS, PaaS, even IaaS. You just basically have the cloud native. Then you have the on-premise, which is the third one, which is basically you have a lot of like an on-premise footprint today. And co-management is mainly like sort of like a hybrid, I would call it. So you're managing together, which is probably for large scale organization that falls somewhere in this spectrum. They have some on-premise, some cloud, maybe 80-20, 70-30, depending on their journey to digitalization. So usually what happens is that you find doing both to some degree. And the final is the evaluation and local onboarding. Like this is literally like, I mean, how the specific onboarding will work. And this is basically where the deployment method kicks in, right? I think it's important to understand at a high level what these are. If you really want, you can go in the document and Microsoft actually provide like steps how to do them. And then you can do the full like a lab actually also going to do a local script. You can also do Intune. But the point is like understanding what they are is very critical. How part is something that I would say if you have time, you should do it at least. Local script, easiest one, and then Intune also easier. But if you have set up for the like a full group policy, like you have that feature with the Active Directory setup, then you can also do that. Now, I will talk about them in a second in the demo, so I'm not going to go in detail right now. But there are different methods depending on the different topologies. If you have a really small environment with few devices, or you're just doing the test, like a wrap or something like an environment. Local script is the easiest one. You download something, you configure it, and within 5 minutes you're up and ready. So it's a very, very fast way of doing that. Group policy, on the other hand, is like more for the hybrid, like co-management style operations, where you have the ability to push everything as part of the group policy. It's a feature exists. So again, I'm not going to go in detail what it is, but this sort of like you're basically pushing it out as a group. And then there's a whole thing with the Microsoft endpoint management, device management, MEM, MDM. So Intune is one example of that. This is quite popular these days. So we'll talk about that. And endpoint configuration manager, similar, that you basically do and use that as a tool. You can write a custom script. You can use Azure Defender. So there's a range of things, right? The idea is not to get like master each one of them, just know them, read the doc, get familiar with them, and that should be good enough. Now, one thing that again will come up again that to configure the capabilities. So this is where I think it's more like the understanding capabilities is more important than how do you do it. Basics are important, like investigating and doing that, but advanced, I won't recommend that until you really want to do it on your own. But understanding what the endpoint detection response is, we're going to talk about that next, so we'll go through that. But that is something that you are expected to learn. Like, I mean, you need to know what exactly that means. Next generation protection means like you're making a decision based on the context, and then the signals that are coming in. And remember, there's a lot of like machine learning based algorithm baked into the product when they're performing the anomaly detection for you. So that's sort of like a next generation part of it. And then you want to reduce the attack surface with it. So we talk about the ND5 architecture. Just reminder there. This is a document you can download. I think it's like a couple of pages long, and it's sort of like providing you an overview with the links to the specific documentation. How do you put like Defender for endpoint into your SOC, and then it will give you like a cloud native architecture, co-management with hybrid, on-premises, and then how do you actually perform the onboarding, right? Now, one thing that you will see a lot, also the language here, which is important to understand. It says that deploy an endpoint detection and response EDR solution. So the EDR is a term here, like an endpoint detection and response. There is another term that you will hear, which is called the XDR, which is extended detection and response. All right. Now, again, before I go and tell you what it is, anyone know attending the session what XDR is and how different from the EDR? Take a guess if you don't know. I think you probably will land somewhere pretty close anyways. Put it in the Q&A. I'm just curious. Simple. So when you do the endpoint detection and response, right? So you're basically taking signals from your devices, right? That's your endpoint. Now, when you do that, you have that sort of like visibility into what's going on into the endpoint, and you're performing some sort of like a response, meaning like remediation, hopefully. So the XDR, on the other hand, X stands for extended. And if you look at the Microsoft Defender, I would call it like a suite of products or services, right? So you have Defender for like endpoint, you have Defender for Office, you have Defender for cloud apps, IoT, list goes on, container and all that, right? When you pick all the signals, right, and feed into M365 Defender, which is like an umbrella, right? When you feed into that, all the signals, and then you're performing the response and remediating the threats, right? Then you're performing the extended detection and response. So basically that's the idea, threat reduction, right? Okay, I do have a couple of questions here. Let me take those before, I need to scroll through more. Someone answer extended threat reduction. Yes, right there. Spot on. Question about the exam reference SC200 with the latest exam. Great question. I don't know. I didn't go out for that book, so I don't know. But the way you can actually test it is, I actually wrote a book on MC300. I know how to test these things out, right? The easiest way to know for you as someone who buy the book or reading it online, go into and look at the release date of the book. I don't know when the SC200 book come out. Let's say it come out in, July of 2021. I don't know that. I'm just making it up. Let's say it come out in July 2021. And look at the exam objectives on the website and see when they were revised. If there is a delta between the two, like for a few months, typically what happens is that when there's a new edition, it covers all the things up until a few months before the book was released, because there's a sort of like a cutoff date. But if they are not aligned at all, then I would assume they're not up to date. So if the book came out last year and you're taking the exam now, and there's a changes, like you can see that in the exam objectives by looking at the exam objectives covered in the book, you probably will have to have some, you will assume some gap over there. Now, again, I won't assume a terrible difference between them, but what percentage, it depends. I can tell you that for MC300 book, the revise is maybe like 20% of the content, after a year. So there was that. But I think it's still relevant portions there. So you should, if you have access to it, then you should read it. Better to go through it than not, I would say. Okay. Okay, so just to conclude on this, right? So yeah, so this is a PDF document. I would recommend go and just download it and read it. Much better than just doing everything as a lab for this particular topic, just because it's too much going on there. And frankly, you're not expected to perform everything, right? So knowing capabilities at a high level or 200 level is good enough. But you should know like what options are there, right? So these are the options out there, and I will show you my environment, so you will actually get a hunch of like at least one of it. But local script and the group policy, we talk about that. Now, here's the coverage, right? So for Mac OS, Linux server, iOS, Android. So I think the theme here is that, and this is something you will find out, all the operating systems that are common in the for the consumers and the enterprises are here. And then most of the relevant versions are supported. I think that's the key takeaway for the deployment and methods. Okay, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to do a demo, and I will show you Defender for Endpoint. And, so just a reminder here, this is the Defender, Microsoft 365 Defender default landing page. Now, the most relevant part here is going to be two things, right, for the endpoint. The first thing is that how do you configure it, right? So I will do this. I will show you something that will help you quite a lot when you're working with this, right? So I will just go and sign in here. Oh, let me change my password. I think I changed it. I need to figure it out. But I can actually show you here, hopefully. Basically, I want to show you the licenses, right? And let me get back to it. I mean, we don't have to start with that, but we'll come back to it. So the Defender for Endpoints, I want to call it out here, is you need to buy the license. Then this option will show up, right? And what you can do is that with every other thing that I'm doing, if you ever stuck, then remember the PDF that we looked yesterday. I will just bring it up here just for the reference real quick. Actually, this may be even better. So if you go here and just search for it, endpoint, and then you will have Defender for Endpoint. I will say that you should go with P2. P2 is a superset of P1 features. But the point is that you get here and then you find out which license you need. And most likely, if you're working towards the exam and you don't want to pay for it, then most of these products have 30 to 60 to sometimes 90 days of free trial. And that's something I will show you. It show up in the Office 365 admin portal, what license you have. Maybe we do it towards the end of this demo. Because I need to figure out my password. I forgot it. But anyway, so basically the idea is that you have an endpoint option here. Now, when you get into the endpoint, right, it actually will show you the license here once you got it. So I have the Microsoft Defender for Endpoint, Plan P2. If you're starting up and you don't see it, you just basically sign in with your account like a global admin, and then you go and sign up for trial. That's all you have to do. And usually it takes like 5 to 10 minutes to refresh it, and then it will come up here. That's what I did, literally. Nothing like really super complicated in that. Now, once you're here, what you do is you will see this option here, device management, right? There's an onboarding and there's an offboarding. Now, onboarding is what we're going to focus on. Offboarding just means that you want Defender for Endpoint based software out of your system, right? So you can read about it, but I think the most important is the onboarding in this case because we are looking into getting those signals in. So the first thing is that what operating system, and you can see all the supported operating systems over here. One thing that you may see in the exam, not the exact version, but just the range of operating system, right? So that is important, right? So just getting a holistic view, because why it is important? Because if you're a security operation analyst today in a large organization and someone want to bring their own device, most likely there would be some flexibility for them to use it. It's just practical these days. What they can do, we can talk about it. That's your job too, like how you can tighten it up, like what access they can have. But you just don't want them to have no access with a supported type of operating system, right? For example, they want to do work with Mac or Linux, right? And you want to have them actually access to their email, things like that. But anyway, so you wanted to select that. So, I selected Windows 10 11 because that's the operating system I choose to use for the demo, but you can choose the other ones. Then here are the range of options. So these are that identify the architecture piece kicks in. You can have the localist script, or you can actually have the device management in tune. Either way, you basically have some sort of like a package, you download it on the device, or you can actually push it using some configuration management software like a group policy and so on and so forth. So you can do that. You can also do custom scripting, by the way, right? Like depending on the device. So you can do a lot, but typically you end up with some sort of like a device management solution these days, because they're basically like provide a good protection around the attack surface throughout. Okay, and then you basically perform a test, and then you say, oh, my device is onboarded, right? Now, once you complete that, what happens is, let me scroll up a little bit. You will have these assets tab over here. If you go into the devices, you will see my Windows 11 ENT, and I have also another one. This is more like a server that I installed, and I'm using actually. So we have two devices here. So this is my Windows ENT device over here. Okay, so we have the Windows ENT device over here, and then you have some things going on here, right? Now I'm going to cover that in a minute here, right? But where this data is coming from, right? We know that this is the device over here. Now this is where things can be a little complicated if you never played with this service. That this is again M365 portal, so remember all the signals are going in, and this will be your home for most part. But if you wanted to go really deep into Defender for Endpoint, you will go to the Defender for Endpoint page or the portal, which is basically Microsoft Endpoint Manager. So I will give it a few seconds to load. Here, and I think it's. I think I need to sign in with